Welcome to the second First Friday SASH session. It is a first of its kind, a book talk by Beau Dure. Thanks for joining us again at the Society for American Soccer History. If you're interested in joining us, ussoccerhistory.org. Please join us through the website there, as well as check out recent posts. And as always, this will be recorded and posted on the Society's webpage. I'd like to introduce the secretary of our Society, Zach Bigalki, who is also a PhD candidate at the Pennsylvania State University. He will be moderating today's conversation. So I'll turn it over to Zach.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's great to be here today. And first and foremost, I just want to thank everybody here. Please make sure that you're muted while we're in the midst of this initial discussion. We'll have questions and answers, a session for questions and answers after we talk. And then, but thank you so much for being here. As Tom said, please check out the website. And it's really a pleasure to be here with Beau Dure today. He's been covering soccer for decades now. I'm sure you've all seen his work at, USA Today, ESPN, 442, Soccer America. Several great books already out, but we're here specifically today to talk about the newest one that was a project of the pandemic, if you will. It's 2012, the year that saved women's soccer. For our session today, I first, just want to turn it over to Beau to tell us a little bit about, the book itself and his journey toward creating it. So I'll turn over the floor now, and thank you so much, Beau.
Thank you, Zach and Tom. And I'm going to pop up the slideshow that I have now and show that. And yeah, I don't remember what made me decide, hey, this is the book that I should do. It had kicked around in my head for a little while, and then, with the pandemic, I thought, well, I have a little bit more time now because, freelancing slows down a little bit at a time like this. And maybe some players have spare time because they're not playing. So maybe I can get them to contribute. And the idea was to do it as, I say, an oral history. I mean, actually email's a lot easier because you're not transcribing all the time. There's less room for error. So I got 30-some people to contribute to this. There were a few people I missed out on, and it's kind of a funny thing. When I did my MLS book years and years ago, I actually had an agent tell me, oh, players won't do it unless you pay them. Everybody I talked with everybody I contacted, with one exception, was happy to do it. And one person contacted me after the fact saying, why didn't you talk to me? Here, I was batting about 600. There were some players, I think to some extent, once they realized there was going to be an NWSL season, then they started to ramp up a little bit. They weren't quite as interested. The reason I call it the bridge year, you'll see, is that it bridges the gap between the last two professional leagues. And if I can skip ahead, there we go. And here's the timeline of professional women's leagues. And so you may remember the WUSA. That was, in 2001, by most metrics, that was a big success. I mean, the Washington Freedom were averaging more than 10,000 fans per game. There are a lot of other places that are averaging more than 5,000. So, those are numbers that people would be happy to see today. The problem was they spent a ton of money to get there. And at the time, they had the best players in the world, without a doubt. They got nearly everybody they wanted to be in this league. All the U.S. players, of course, and then some of the best from Germany, some of the best from China, some of the best from Sweden. It was without a doubt the best league in the world. It might still be the best league the world has ever seen, because the European leagues today have some very good teams like Lyon and Wolfsburg, but they don't have a good top to bottom league like the WSA was. Unfortunately, they spend a ton of money, and in horrible timing, right before the Women's World Cup, the one that had been relocated from China to the USA because of the last nasty virus that came out of China, SARS. Nobody wanted to go to China, and so it got relocated here. Didn't quite have as much fanfare as 1999 did, but it would have been nice to still have that league around to, just keep some continuity going. And they refused to admit that they were going away at first. In 2004, they played a couple of these little festivals where they said, oh, here's the Washington Freedom. Well, really, one group of national team players and other players had been in WSA versus another. There wasn't a lot of rhyme or reason to it, and that wasn't enough to get it going. Now, I put on this timeline, I put those intervening years in black for a reason. That was the dark time. Those are the dark ages. And you can see, that's a long time. That's 5 years. Then WPS kept getting postponed. I think at first I heard 2007. Then it was definitely supposed to launch in 2008, but they went back to 2009. And I put some question marks after 2011. And let's see what happened there. Well, actually, first, this is the reason I wrote the book. Because you look back, this was from this dark time, 2004 to 2008. And these are all U.S. eligible players. I didn't count, Australians and French players and so forth. Most of these players left the game entirely by the time WPS rolled around in 2009. And the green, as it says there, that those are players who played in the WSA in 2003 and were not capped. But the players who are underlined, Julie Augustiniak, Stacey Burt, Carrie Sarver, and Lindsay Stecker, those were all players who at least had gone to a national team camp. And a lot of those players had the potential to at least challenge for national team spots down the road. The next color grouping, those are all players who were capped at some point and were playing in the WUSA, and that the players in italics were actually capped before 2001. And some of those names, Joy Fawcett wasn't going to be on the upside. Neither was Julie Foudy. Neither was that person in there 2 spaces below Julie Foudy. I'm not sure of her name, Mia Ham, somebody. So that list includes some people who had been on the national team and they were hardly unknowns. But it also includes some people. The third name on that list is one that sticks out to me. That's Lakeisha Bean. She at one point had a legitimate shot at being the goalkeeper of the future. And so that's a real shame that she wasn't able to continue. Mandy Clemens, you might remember trying to plug the WUSA on The Bachelor. She was on there trying to win the affections of Jesse Palmer, but not trying to win it too hard because Jesse Palmer was no match for Mandy Clemens intellectually. So, but down that list, a lot of pretty good players. Then the gray area, that is an interesting list because those are people who were capped between 2000 and 2003, never played in a top flight professional league in the US. Maybe 1 or 2 of them went and played in Europe, but for the most part, those were all players who were in college when they were capped. And so, now some of them had catastrophic injuries. Keisha Bell actually never played after 2001. Nandy Price, who was a really talented prospect, tore up her knees as well. And then you have the great story of Alicia Kramer-Rose, who stopped playing for the national team and didn't play didn't play professionally because she didn't want to play on Sundays. She went to BYU where they can schedule around Sundays, and dropped out for that reason. There is one name I want to point out here. It's not like all these players quit their athletic career. If you look up in that last column, you'll see Shauna Robach. Shauna Robach became an Olympic medalist, just not in soccer. She was a silver medalist in the 2006 Olympics in women's bobsled as a driver. Very impressive person. So how did we get to this situation? How did we get into a time without a top flight league? 2011 gets a lot of the focus, and I'll briefly touch on that. But 2010, you can see how the league was not in very good shape. You had, the Los Angeles Soul was the best team in the league in 2009. They were upset in the final by Sky Blue. And they went through the WPS draft, and everyone thought things were okay. And then a sale had fallen through, and then what we realized was AEG, of course, Anschutz Entertainment Group, which had propped up MLS for through its start time, had only committed for 1 year. And they were paying a lot in rent, and they'd obviously lost money, and so no wonder the sale fell through. And so there you go. And I do need to quickly plug, if you see at the top, read more at funwhileitlasted.net. If you haven't seen that site, I highly recommend it. It's not just women's soccer. I mean, the person who runs it, Andy Crossley, was an executive with the Boston Breakers women's soccer team. But he has not just soccer. If you want to know what happened to a lacrosse league or a lacrosse team, he has that. And he has tons of great information. And when it comes to women's soccer, he has everything. Including the Curse of Marta, because the two teams that Marta played for in 2009 was Los Angeles. In 2010, it was FC Gold Pride, the Bay Area team, and that was a ton of money. It was, they were theoretically salary capped, but it was kind of like the early MLS where, yeah, they're salary capped, but Jorge Campos gets use of a Ferrari. So this is sort of almost like an off book or, off cap anyway, salary. And she made her teams very good, and FC Gold Pride was a fantastic team. They won the league and then folded. Actually, I should take that back. WPS, to my knowledge, did not have a salary cap, but they were supposed to. They weren't supposed to be spending $500,000 on players. The worst was May 2010. And if you followed Division II men's soccer at the time, you'll recognize this name and this story. Jeff Cooper, who was leading the breakaway, or one of the leaders of the breakaway of the USL, and going toward what became the new NASL. What no one knew was that he had basically just turned things over to these brothers from Britain, and they simply stopped paying. And so he had to jump in and say, okay, well, what do we do now? Well, he managed to work out a deal with the NASL, or the Division II 2010 league, whatever the name was. I can't remember off the top of my head. It was very long when they did that shotgun marriage of USL and NASL to get through 2010. St. Louis Athletica folded. And so you have players like Hope Solo and Shannon Botts just up for a dispersal draft 6 games into the season. That's a bad look. That's like the indoor leads in the 2000s. You really don't want to see that happen. It really kills the credibility of the league. And the worst part was that WPS, as far as we could tell, and Tony Antonucci, the commissioner, did talk to the media about this, didn't know that any of this was happening until they said, hey, we can't make payroll. So December 2010, the Chicago Red Stars suspend operations, and they eventually drop down to the WPSL. We'll get to them. And then 2010, one of the most colorful stories in U.S. soccer history, Dan Borislaw, the late, great Dan Borislaw, comes in and buys the Washington Freedom. And the Freedom, this is worth noting, they never stopped. They kept going, and they played first an exhibition schedule. They had players like Lindsay Stecker, who I mentioned before, who was working in, I believe she was in Homeland Security, so she stayed in Washington. So she was going. They played first an exhibition season where they would play teams from the W League and teams, actually a couple of teams from Europe. Somebody might come over and play the Freedom. And they had a lot of good players come through. And Jim Gabarra, the former national team player and indoor player and longtime women's coach, was out there, and it looked like he was running a youth practice. He's carrying a bag of balls and some cones and things like that. And you had some really good players. In fact, there were players like Lori Lindsay, who is now on the Athletes Council, and you may have seen doing commentary on NWSL games. She essentially played her way into the national team playing in this amateur league, because the Freedom did eventually join the W League. So we get to 2011, and Dan Borislaw, if you're not familiar with him, I would Google him and maybe add the word Deadspin. You could also add the word Duresport, because I certainly wrote about that a ton, or you could Google him and my name. Hopefully some of my ESPN stories are still on, because for some reason he took a liking to me. I'm not really sure why. It wasn't like I was particularly nice to him, but he would he would call me when something was going on. In fact, I found out that WPS had suspended operations in early 2012 when I was making my only attempt to learn how to ski. It didn't go well. I went in for lunch, checked my BlackBerry, which at the time, was, state-of-the-art phone, and there was a message from Dan Borislav saying, "Did you hear the league suspended operations?" Oh boy. So I had to go write about it. And what happened was that they were down to 6 teams already. And they cut Magic Jack, which Dan Barstow had renamed the Washington Freedom when he moved them to South Florida. He named it after one of his inventions. And so, they were down to 6. Then the league said, well, we're terminating you. And they were down to 5. U.S. Soccer at first said, well, we're not going to sanction you with 5. They managed to work it out, and they managed to work out something with Borislav. This was hilarious. They were going to turn Magic Jack into essentially the Harlem Globetrotters, and they were going to play exhibition games so he could keep playing, but they wouldn't be in WPS. The deal fell apart. People blame everyone else. The league said that U.S. Soccer said they couldn't do it. Borislav said, that's baloney. You were just taking me for a ride. But fortunately, some teams were already working on what happened next. And what happened next, this is one of the 2 leads to note. And have to reiterate here, there were 2 amateur leagues. You could enter a professional team in those leagues. And one of these, the Western New York Flash, actually competed as an amateur team in 2010, or competed as a professional team in the W League in 2010. They won, of course. Then they moved into WPS, and they had a fantastic team, won the championship. They were really, really good. So you had these teams that wanted to keep going. And so the Breakers and the Flash both played in the 2011 WPS season, and they said, well, let's keep going. And Chicago Red Stars bounced back up. They had played in the WPSL. And so this league was under the auspices of the WPSL and essentially just another upper division in it, you might say. And they had to scrounge for teams a little bit because the Flash still happy to play professionally. The Breakers still happy to play professionally. The Red Stars were professionally run and had players who were on the national team pool, like Lori Kolupny. But they were technically an amateur team, again, because they used college players. And if you're not familiar, the W League and the WPSL, just like the NPSL and USL League 2, I guess, I lose track. But those are mostly summer leagues for college eligible players. And to be college eligible, you have to be playing on an amateur team. You can play against professionals, you just cannot play on a professional team. Consult the NCAA and ask why that makes any sense. I don't know. There were 3 pretty good clubs from the WPSL that jumped in, Chesapeake Charge, FC Indiana, and New England. And then 2 teams, the Philadelphia Fever, completely from scratch. And that was run by Matt Driver, who you may know from his efforts to start the Neo-American Soccer League in the same decade. And the New York Fury actually built upon an existing club. There was a long-standing youth club called the Fury or Albertson Fury, and they had a team called the Long Island Fury that played in WPSL. They just said, well, let's form the New York Fury and join this. And they were the other professional team in this league. They were coached by Paul Riley, who had coached the Philadelphia Independents in WPS. They had a lot of former Philadelphia Independents players on that team. So as you can imagine, the 3 teams from WPS and the Fury were essentially the top 4. The New England Mutiny, very well run. They were a solid 5th. The other 3 teams really struggled. But they were decent games. It wasn't like it was all 10-0. I mean, you look at the Bundesliga in Germany, or you look at the typical league game for Lyon in France. They might win 10-0. There were no 10-0 scores in this league. The players in WPSL Elite, again, I mentioned Lori Kolupny. Kat Whitehill was toward the end of her career. So was Leslie Osborne, her teammate. Allie Long was still kind of on the upswing, made the national team a bit later. Megan Klingenberg, still fairly young at the time. So those are all pretty legit players. And, Heather O'Reilly, another player who was on the national team at the time. Now, if you were on the national team at the time, 2012 was an Olympic year, so you weren't free for a lot of that time. So O'Reilly only played a handful of games. Tobin Heath only played a handful of games, as did a couple of players in the other league. I've just mentioned them, the W League, which was the USL's women's league at the time. And Seattle just went nuts. They signed Hope Solo. They signed Alex Morgan. They signed Megan Rapinoe. They signed a young but dangerous Sydney Leroux. They had Keelan Winters, who was in the national team pool. Stephanie Cox, who was in the national team pool. And so I'd actually urge you to look up on YouTube. This game is on YouTube in its entirety, and it's not a bad broadcast. Seattle versus the Colorado Rush. And you'll see there Lindsey Horan. That's her in her PSG outfit, because she became, as far as anyone knows, the first player to jump from high school straight to a major professional team. She was supposed to go to North Carolina, but then PSG came calling, and so she actually skipped high school and went pro. The Kobe Bryant essentially every day. And the Seattle game against the Colorado Rush was pretty good. Seattle obviously had way more talent, but Colorado made it interesting, and Horan, you could see her talent there right away. And another national team player, obviously Solo and Morgan were only there some of the time for a few games. Becky Sauerbrunn, still on the upswing of her career, probably not. I maintain that Sauerbrunn was the best women's soccer defender of the 2010s. And, she was showing it there to an extent. She also scored a goal from the run of play for DC United Women, which I believe is only the second time she's done that in her career. She she's only even scored 1 or 2 on corner kicks or set pieces. And then Pally Blues, way over on the left there with Lynn Williams, they were mostly college players, and actually a few who weren't, like Whitney Engen, who was in the national team pool. But Lynn Williams was a player who was at Pepperdine, not getting a ton of attention, but she came in and just tore it up for Pally Blues. So to close out here, this is the quote, or at least part of this quote, is on the cover of the book. That's McCall Zerboni, who had played in WPS. She then wound up with Western New York, and she decided to hang around in Western New York when they dropped out of, or when WPS folded, because they kept going and gave her a place to train and then compete in WPSL Elite. She stayed there for another couple of years when Western New York moved into the NWSL. And so it was a bridge in sense for some organizations. The Chicago Red Stars are still playing today. The Western New York Flash, whose owner, Joe Salin, actually helped out some of the travel costs in WPSL Elite. The Salin family finally kind of pulled the plug on that, but they moved intact to North Carolina, where they are the dominant team in NWSL the last few years, upsetting the playoffs this year. But that's the North Carolina Courage. The Boston Breakers, unfortunately, not with us anymore. But it was a good bridge for organizations, and it was a great bridge for players. Allie Long was not yet in the national team picture at that point. And look at McCall Zerboni here. Zerboni is credited as, and a lot of these records aren't necessarily complete, but we believe she is the oldest player to make her national team debut. October 2017, she was 30. And she says here that she would not have competed, or it was unlikely that she would have stayed in soccer. Because if you go back to the timeline, in fact, I will go back to the timeline, and you can see that huge gap, 5 years. In this case, it was 1 year, and they actually had some professional soccer even in that year before a full-fledged league took root in 2013. And so if you hadn't had that, I maintain that perhaps the U.S. women's soccer would have really declined without this. Perhaps the NWSL doesn't start in 2013. Perhaps it's not on as solid ground as it was. Perhaps women's soccer is just struggling as a professional league at that time, and perhaps you have another one of these, another lost generation, And if you had lost that much talent in 2012, does the U.S. win the World Cup in 2015, 2019? I don't know. So you can see why this book I thought was a good year to write about. And it was really a pleasure to do it. It's relatively short. It's about 75 pages paperback, but I think it covers it pretty well. And I've gotten good feedback on the people I interviewed. We're all pretty happy with it. And I think it was I get accused sometimes of being too negative about women's soccer. I felt like this was a nice positive story to just show, how resilient women's soccer has been, and how much respect we should all have for the players who've been through this. So happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you so much, Beau. I think what you offered us here in this presentation really shows sort of the underlying thought processes you went through to get to 2012 as this sort of bridge year, as you mentioned. And I think, what you've offered here is a really valuable contribution, especially as you said, this is very much an oral history rather than a more traditional book written on this. And I guess one of my questions to you that came up as I was reading the book is, how do you think this can further our understanding or the ways that we present these histories to the public?
That's a good question. I've always enjoyed reading oral histories. The huge one that's somewhere in these shelves behind me was on Saturday Night Live by Tom Shales, and talked with people from all generations of it, and went more or less chronologically as this is. And yeah, I always enjoyed it as a reader, but I also found it just kind of fun to do. I actually took a class, and I know I'm talking with a lot of PhDs and PhD candidates in here. I am a lowly master's degree holder, but I did that at Duke, and I took an oral history class and really enjoyed it. I think it's a good process. And as someone who has to go then and write it, sometimes I feel like when I'm writing all of these things, if it's predominantly quotes, especially in this case, I wanted it to be predominantly quotes. I kind of wish the ratio of quotes to my text was higher than it was. But you can, when you're writing, you can find yourself trying to shoehorn in all of these quotes, and it makes for some awkward language sometimes. It's sort of like, blah, 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 Whitehill said, Leslie Osborne agreed, blah, 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 blah. And so, to write transitions between all those quotes, you're adding a lot of unnecessary words. So in this case, where the ratio of quotes to my text was still pretty high, it's probably 50-50-ish. So, and I had to do some explanatory text about, what was going on. There's some things that I never quite got a full story on. For example, there was a game that was, it was the New York Fury at Philadelphia on a Sunday. It was stormed out. They had thunderstorms, and they were supposed to play the next day, and they never did. I didn't get an answer as to what exactly happened in the standings. It's recorded as a win for New York, but Matt Driver told me that, they couldn't. New York didn't have enough players to play the next day. Okay, then why wasn't it a forfeit for New York? So you have things like that went on that required as much explanation as I could give them. And there were, interesting things like there was a game forfeited because one player's paperwork was somehow tied up in Russia. And it doesn't even make a lot of sense. There were some players who played in Russia during that offseason. One person that I would have loved to talk to but didn't was Yael Aberbush, who also played in the W League at the time. And she had played in WPS, went on to play in the WSL, was in the national team pool. She was receptive to talking, but we never got around to it because she has launched a business that's doing very well, Technique Football, where she helps train kids. She's also the past executive director of the NWSL Players Association. So you can imagine how busy she was with that as they tried to sort out playing their month-long tournament in Utah, which was a success. A lot of credit to them. And knowing her, I'm sure she had a lot to do with that. So she had those two things, and she's pregnant. So I'll give Yael a little bit of a pass for for not talking to me for this book.
Completely understandable. One last question I want to ask before we open this up to everybody here for questions is just quickly, it's if I'm not mistaken, this was your first self-published effort in this regard. I don't know if you've done other self-publishing before, but most of your writing, most of your books have been published through traditional outlets. And what was the experience like in terms of getting this out and, especially being able to do it in such a quick time frame as you were?
Yeah, well, the books you've heard of were published by traditional houses. I've done a couple of other. The book I did on the first season of the Washington Spirit, called Enduring Spirit, where I followed them around for a season, and their 2013, their inaugural season. It wasn't particularly successful for a variety of reasons. One was not having the marketing push of the publisher behind it. One was the fact that the Spirit only won 3 games that year, and they didn't want people to, they were not enthusiastic about having a record of that at the end. Then they were cooperative while I was doing it, but they weren't going to give it any sort of marketing boost after the fact. And also, I don't think it was particularly successful because I don't know, and I don't mean to sound sexist here. I think sometimes I think women tend to be a little bit more wary of people coming in and asking questions. And because, you go back again to the fact that for my MLS book, everybody wanted to talk. For the Spirit book, for this book that I just did, 2012, maybe 60% of the people wanted to talk. For the Spirit book, I did interview everybody, but people were friendly to me, but not really talkative, and so I didn't get a really good story out of it. I also self-published a book on youth soccer called Single Digit Soccer, about coaching and about my experiences dealing with U9 and below. That went pretty well. It's an okay book, but it's tough to market it because you're trying to market it to soccer parents who don't really know that they're soccer parents in a sense. So it's hard to place a Facebook ad targeting those people because the people who talk about youth soccer, a lot of people who already know about it or think they know everything about it, so they're not going to read that book. I also self-published a memoir of my time covering mixed martial arts. As of now, it has sold 0 copies. I'm actually kind of proud of that. I almost want to keep it at that. There are a couple of people who've read it. Kindle, Amazon has some program called Kindle Unlimited where people can read for free, and so I've made probably 38 cents on that book so far. I'm really proud of that. So the biggest problem with self-publishing is, your own expenses, and because my MLS book, I got in advance and it made money for a while. I probably still do some royalties, but that publisher was bought out by the University of Nebraska Press. We had to hound them for royalties for a while. And at this point, it's probably far enough along that it's not enough money to go through that effort. Enduring Spirit, I lost money on that because I paid for my cover photo, I paid an editor, and I racked up a lot of travel expenses. And it only sold in the couple hundreds. So I did not get that money back. Single Digit Soccer, the cover photo is my son's shoelace draped over a soccer ball that I shot at our practice field when he was playing for a club, by the way, led by Bill Hamid's father, Sully, who is a tremendous guy. So the cover photo was free. The cover design was free. I did pay an editor. It was someone who didn't know anything about it. I was a copy editor for a long time, and this copy editor said, well, I don't know anything about soccer. I said, good, because that's the audience I'm writing for. That one I probably broke even on, did a little better. The MMA thing, yeah, I did pay an editor, but not much. I'm not too worried about that. Of course, with traditional publishers, not sure how much I should say about how things have gone with that going through a traditional publisher, but I can tell you that I paid for a publicist and I have not gotten the bang for the buck that I was hoping for out of that. So it's hard to tell I was actually talking with a friend of mine today who has co-written a lot of athlete biographies. So, I should tell everybody here, if you're looking for easy money, do that. Find a player who has a name, and I don't know the exact process, but let them go ahead and do that. In fact, when I pitched one of my books, I actually pitched it to someone who got back to me the next day, and I was like, "Wow, you must really like it." And they said, "Nah, I don't think soccer books are going to sell, but would you like to, co-write a book with the ex-girlfriend of one of the Eagles?" And he actually sent me a book that was written, that his wife had co-written with someone who dated Joe Walsh for about 3 years. And I read it and thought, wow, this is boy, I could probably make money doing that, but I'd feel pretty dirty.
Yeah, it's amazing where the money is in publishing these days.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's like where the money is in TV. I mean, you could do a fantastic documentary, and unless you have like ESPN's marketing heft behind it, you're not going to make as much money as you could if you were, it's just like journalists make a lot less money than people who go on television, both in news and sports, and just yell, with no knowledge of what they're talking about.
Certainly. Well, let me open up the floor now to everybody. If anybody has any questions, comments, things they want to say about this book, or just ask Beau generally, please do so now. Feel free to turn on your microphone and just go for it.
I do want to see Steve's book about Matt Driver. I looked at the chat.
Yeah, I tell you, there's still laws about slander and defamation in this country. I need to be careful.
Yeah. David, I see you unmuted.
Yeah. First of all, congratulations. I think the format of the book and what it chronicles, absolutely fascinating. 2012 was a really, really interesting year in terms of the way things shook out in terms of professional soccer. I know when I was invited down to Soho to interview with the Cosmos, the talk that day was we were going to have a women's team too. We just needed to see how the whole dynamic shook out. And here we are 8 years later nearly, and the Cosmos don't have a women's team, and the professional league has evolved to the point it is. So it was really wild to be taken back on that time trip to that really fascinating year. But I wanted to connect the dots a little bit between this book and Single Digit Soccer. There are a few passages that really stood out to me. First of all, Schaefer, I don't know if that's how you pronounce her name, but the line on page 19, I was meant to be a breaker. That really affected me. And then I want to make a link between that sense of institutional loyalty and the kind of ambition and dream for a young girl, and how continuity and sustainability of a club can play into that notion. Then how, Ferrara and McCormick in particular are talking about pay to play as being a way of sustaining players, right? McCormick started and ran a soccer club and ran a showcase. And also, the idea of Colorado Rush. I don't know the whole history of the Rush organization, but I wondered if you could maybe connect the dots between this book and your other project, which still seems to me an ongoing project for you, your engagement with the youth soccer landscape, and the way in which these two silos really maybe are more interconnected than we acknowledge, or maybe they should be. And also just this, the idea of that Seattle Sounders team when they had all the stars there, and the idea of them being the Sounders as opposed to something else, the idea of it being the DC United women's team, and just those notions of identity and the way that connects with pay to play at the youth landscape. I hope you can piece that together as kind of a question, but to me, that was where this was really fascinating. Thanks.
Sure. Well, I'll work backwards a little bit. The MLS affiliations here were really loose. DC United, it was almost as if they just sort of, handed them jerseys and said, okay, yeah, here you go, DC United. I believe they were not able to keep that going into the next league because of, I don't know, Adidas versus Nike or something like that. But it was never that strong an affiliation to begin with. In fact, what's interesting now is that the Spirit are starting to build up. relationship with DC United. Of course, the Spirit played 2 games at Audi Field last season. They would have played, I think, 5 there this season. It's a heartbreaker that they did not, because the Spirit is such a fun team to watch. Good young attackers. It's a great atmosphere at Audi Field, and they weren't able to do it for obvious reasons. And the Sounders women, perhaps not as tight as the tightest one is the Portland Timbers and the Portland Thorns, where the Thorns they'll easily draw 15,000 fans per game, dwarfing the attendance at any other women's team. And it's really impressive how they interact. The Utah teams are also pretty good. Houston and Orlando, not quite as strong. Seattle really embraced that team for a while, and they would sort of make reference to these players being Sounders. That team is now called Sound FC. So dissociated from the Sounders, which I think is a real shame. When they had Solo and Morgan and so forth, they could draw about 4,500 players. And bear in mind, the W League, usually their attendances are in the, if they're maybe the 300 range. And DC United women drew 1,000 a couple of times that season, because they weren't a bad organization, and they had not just Becky Sauerbrunn, but also a very young Andy Sullivan, and also Joanna Lohman, who had a pretty good name for herself at the time, was working with and dating an English player named Leanne Sanderson. So that was a pretty good organization as well. To tie it back to youth soccer, in late 2010, I was out as a DC DMV resident. I was furious that no one stepped up to keep the Washington Freedom in this area, because I would look, just a few miles away from me, McLean Youth Soccer. They have more money than God. It's just, I had a friend who played there, and she, I was talking with her, and she was excited to tell me that her daughter had fouled Dick Cheney's granddaughter. That is connections, that is money. They could have pulled together an ownership group out of that club, and they didn't. And I don't understand why. So you have these occasional things where a youth soccer team will put up a senior level team. That was the Colorado Rush. And the Rush organization now has more locations than I can count. It seems like a new one starts every day. At this point, I'm doing a club directory. I still don't know if Los Angeles Rush and California Rush are the same team, same collection of teams. I don't know. What do you call it? Is the whole organization a club? Is the Georgia Rush and the Colorado Rush in the same organization? I don't know. Of course, one of those mega clubs, GPS, fell apart just a couple months ago under kind of scandalous and murky situation. And they actually had a partnership with Bayern Munich, and Bayern Munich's comment was basically, huh? So, yeah, I feel like there should be more interplay. There are some clubs that, even aside from the MLS Development Academy now it's the MLS Academy. MLS used to require its teams to be in the Development Academy, and most NWSL clubs have some sort of youth presence as well, either in the ECNL or the Girls Academy League that just started, or they were in the DA. The Utah teams have a presence in Arizona, actually, and so they have Real Salt Lake, Arizona, and they have Utah Royals, Arizona. So there are some that are building there, and the Freedom had actually built in those years in between, without a full-fledged professional league. They actually had built relationships with youth clubs. So they were hopefully trying to inspire the top girls in those clubs. Hey, maybe you can come play for the Freedom one day, and Andy Sullivan did. So yeah, there are some from the bottom up, some from the top down, outside of any conventional channels. I mean, and you know that the Cosmos had an academy as well, even though they weren't. They started that, I believe, before they were in the Development Academy. They already had stuff in the youth ranks.
Well, that's complicated. Not exactly. No.
Right.
That's a whole other SASH session.
Right. Yeah, it is. But there are some clubs that do their FC Dallas, which has a great men's academy, also has a girls' academy, which a couple of MLS organizations do. A couple of them, it's complicated. I mean, the NCFC, North Carolina FC, and North Carolina Courage are in the same ownership group and the same organization. They both have youth academies, and it's hard to tell how they're organized. So, yeah, I've been hoping for a long time that there would be sort of a top, come from the top down and come from the bottom up. I think top down seems to be working pretty well now. Bottom up, I'm still kind of surprised that doesn't happen more often. Now, granted, senior level teams don't make a lot of money. I mean, the joke is, how do you run a soccer club and get $1 million? The answer is start with $2 million. So I guess a lot of youth clubs don't want to make that investment. And of course, given what youth clubs are going through this year, it's not going to happen right now.
Can I ask a tough follow-up? Because I'm told journalists are supposed to do that, right?
Absolutely.
So the players, though, right? It seemed like some of the entities that you're looking at here, a handful of them, maybe a third or more, are actually being funded by the youth pay-to-play structure in one way or the other, whether it's the players directly. The idea, there was the one quote where if you have 4 to 5 private lessons, then you're made.
Yeah.
I don't know how many other people have been on this call, but when you get those approaches like, will you give my kid private tutoring? And it's a bit of a racket. So whether the racket is funding the whole operation through player fees, or whether the players themselves are paying their rent, if not mortgage, by doing coaching on the side, it seems like, again, I know you're very critical of the role pay to play is playing within the soccer landscape, and yet it seemed like for a lot of people involved in 2012, that was how they were staying afloat. So do you have a sense of ambivalence about that, or have you again, are you making those connections between this project and your youth soccer project?
It's a very good point. And, one piece of credit you can give to Sunil Gulati is that he will be blunt. He will be candid. And one of the things, if you asked him about pay to play, he would make the point, well, if you took all that money away, where's the money come from? You may have a club that has far-reaching, tons of travel teams and a rec program underneath that, and maybe they have something at kind of development academy level or something like that that is either free or gives a ton of scholarship money. Okay, well, how does the club get that money to make those teams free, or make the clubs or have them have a lot of financial aid to give? And it's a tough question, because how much sponsorship money can you have at any given time? That's kind of difficult. Now, the main issue I have with pay to play is that there's a lot of wasted money, particularly on travel. What I'm fond of saying is that no one became a better soccer player on an airplane or in a car. And you have all these different leagues, and they're quite honestly set up by different egos, where you can have 2 clubs. You can have a club here and a club there. They're 10 miles apart, and a lot of their teams at the same skill level, and they don't play each other because this one's going up here to play in the Club Elite Premier League, and this club's going down here because they're in the Elite Club Premier Club Elite League, and it's absurd. And so travel becomes a racket. A lot of the tournaments become a racket, and these things are going to be interesting to see how they shake out after COVID, because now a lot of teams aren't going to be traveling as much. You can't go to California. California has said no youth sports for now. So they may find, well, maybe we'll need to play locally. Maybe they'll find, hey, you know what? It makes more sense to go play a game over here that's 2-1 rather than fly. I found an example of, I think it was, it wasn't the Earthquakes. It was another Bay Area team. that flew to Utah to play, not Real Salt Lake, but another Utah team, flew to Utah. This is Girls Development Academy. They win 10-0 and they fly back. What kind of player development is that? How does that help? It doesn't help at all. And so there's the travel aspect of it, and also, I'm guilty of this. My son played 3 years of travel soccer, not at a high level. I wasn't expecting him to play in college. I wasn't even expecting him to make the high school team, which for a lot of travel players that's actually the goal, is to make the high school team, at least in this area where it's really difficult to make a high school team. So because you look at what's in England and so forth and compare it to here, England has the free academies, and close to 100 of them, because there's some league clubs that don't have full-fledged academies, but there's some in the conference and even below that who do. So close to 100 professional academies where it's free. Then you have recreational soccer, which is very cheap, usually coached by a parent, but there may be maybe a technical director who has some sort of experience and so forth. And a lot of other countries, like Iceland, what I've been told about Iceland and why they're so successful is that it seems like every parent there has a B license. So, they're not expecting to be paid big money for it. Here, you have people who have a D license. In fact, I took the D license class for U.S. Soccer. There was a classmate of, first of all, one of my son's coaches was in the class. And then there's some other guy who's running his own academy, and he doesn't even have a D license yet. So you have some dubiously qualified people out there coaching, and they're not better than parents. Some coaches certainly are. Some professional coaches take it really seriously, but then a lot of times you'd be better off with a parent. Now, to answer the question about training sessions, again, well, if you look at where the money goes and where it comes from, so we've just been talking about how you take the travel out of it, you maybe take some of the coaches out of it, and you can cut down expenses that way, and still, the money you're pulling in from recreational soccer, which, recreational soccer is usually a pretty good deal. It's not bad, and they'll offer financial aid for people who really, really need it. So that could still fund, scholarship money for, an elite team if this club has it. The other aspect of it is you can say, well, it does sound like a racket that, these women get to, go out and train some people and make enough money. But the flip side of it is the club doesn't have money to pay them. So, in some cases, they are an amateur club because they have NCAA eligible players on that team. So you get, there are some really good players who played for not technically amateur clubs here. The New Jersey Wildcats, soon after the WSA, had Marinette Pichon, who was one of the leading scorers of WSA from France, and they had one of the best players I've ever seen, Kelly Smith from England, had her on the same team. And so, they're not paying them. So how do they make money? Well, they coach and they get paid for it. So it's, to go back to what Sunil Gulati said, you can say, well, perhaps that's not the most efficient way. Perhaps you're making parents pay money that they really shouldn't. But what do you do to replace it?
I think that's interesting. I know Tom had a question as well. Let's have Tom go next.
I'm going to sneak it in as we're coming up on an hour here. I was just looking at my notes from the Princeton Soccer Conference, where I think Sunil Gulati made one of his last public appearances before COVID. And on this topic, he says, quote, "It is pay to play everywhere around the world. Someone has to pay. The question is, who pays?" End quote. So yeah, appropriate there. But here's my kind of question. Congratulations on the book again, thanks. And thanks for joining us. You open up with that seminal event of the 1999 Women's World Cup. I was at Giant Stadium. My 22-year-old son was an infant and a baby Bjorn in the upper deck, tailgating beforehand. It was an amazing scene. You call that a high point. And in my notes, I have /hubris, right? I think that's a really interesting moment in American soccer history and women's soccer history. You know, all this enthusiasm. You know, you say, you know, women's soccer at that point is the NBA and the men's game is the WNBA.
Jerry Longman said that. I didn't say that. Jerry Longman said that. Yeah, and his book just got picked up for a Netflix movie. So good for him.
Right. So here's the question. In 2012, again, we have this kind of club and country situation, right? The big tent of an Olympic Games, the day-to-day, week-to-week struggles of club soccer in this country. So, you know, could you comment on that kind of duality, in particular with women's soccer, the I guess, tension between club and country, and how one pushes the other over the course of, you know, the late 20th century and on into the early 21st century. Thanks.
Okay, so this is the part where I get to insult everyone who's on the women's national team right now, which will be fun. Because essentially for a long time, especially during those dark ages, the U.S. women's national team was a professional soccer club. And if you didn't make that coming out of college, you were basically done. You know, again, with the very rare exception like Lori Lindsay, which is why I have tremendous respect for Lori Lindsay. Well, one of many reasons. She also was, I believe, the first prominent women's soccer player to come out. There are other people who claim it. But no, she was ahead of them. But so that team, there became a sense of, I hate to say entitlement, but it kind of is, because they were on contract, and you know it was tough to compete for places on that team because you have people who are under contract, and that actually lasted until 2016. Oddly enough, the year that they started the complaint to the EEOC that became their lawsuit, they had a lot of players who were under contract. They still do, but fewer, and now there's not as much of a restriction as calling in players who are not under contract, because through 2016, it was very difficult to bring people in to compete for spots. And I actually just wrote a story for Soccer America. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to plug it. I was looking back at the Tom Sermani, I'd say years, 15 months really, where he was in charge. And he actually brought in about as many new players as he could. And the players denied that there was a player revolt. There was a player revolt. You know, let's not kid ourselves. The veteran players were not happy that it wasn't, you know, me starting with Alex Morgan, you know, every game, you know, ad infinitum, because, you know, you don't do that on a national team. If you're running the German national team, if you're Greg Berhalter and it's, you know, January and you have a friendly, are you going to run out the starting 11 that's in your mind right then? No. You're going to run out a bunch of people who you want to get a look at. And, you know, Sermani was managing to do that a bit. The others were not. So in terms of club versus country, yeah, there's that sense that we're on the national team. And people are, yeah, again, you look at the men's side, you can't always say, oh, well, so-and-so is on the national team. Well, they might be. The next time Berhalter calls people for World Cup qualifiers, maybe that person will get called in, maybe not. Maybe that person gets called in October, doesn't look too impressive, doesn't get called in November, but gets called back in February. So you don't have a set group. With the women, you know, there are a couple of players on the fringe, but generally there's a set group. You might only have, you know, 25 to 28 players get capped in a given year. And what it creates, again, a little less so now because the new CBA as of 2017 is different. But what it creates is a caste system where you have the national team players and those who are not. And if you look at some NWSL games, you may see players immediately after a game, the national team players immediately like run and form their little group. You know, oh, this is us. Well, we're not like them. You know, I play with them in the club, but you know that they're not. They're different. And they actually had a clause at one point in the CBA that said that nobody could come in and make more money off of the NWSL than they did, because they had their national team salary and their NWSL salary that was subsidized by the federation, and so they didn't want. And let's say it was numbers off the top of my head. Let's say they're making $80,000 for the national team and $40,000 for NWSL. Then no one could come in and make more than $40,000 in the NWSL. It's called like a most favored player clause or something like that. So the club versus country. I mean, players, of course, will deny it, but there is a split between national team players and those who are not on the national team. I always felt like referees gave a huge break in the NWSL to players who are on the national team. It's kind of like the Jordan rules for women's soccer. And you may notice that some players opted out of the NWSL tournament they just had. You may notice that every player who opted out is a national team player who is collecting $100,000 from U.S. Soccer right now and not playing. They're secure. They have their spots on the national team and so forth. And, they could have opted out, and I believe any player could have opted out and still been paid somewhat, I think. I can't be sure of that. But a lot of national team players didn't play. Everyone else came out and played hard. Thank you for coming, Osvaldo.
Well, I just want to give everybody an opportunity. We're at about an hour here. We originally talked about having this about an hour. If you're willing to stick around for a couple more questions and people have them, I'd love to maintain that opportunity. But thank you to everybody who can only stay with us for an hour for tuning in. We'll be here every first Friday. So make sure to come back and check out our website at ussoccerhistory.org as we highlight more of these hidden histories of American soccer history. Thank you again, Beau. And does anybody else have any last questions they'd like to throw out there?
Actually, I do have one question.
Sure.
So Jeff Organ, I live in San Diego. I live in Central Texas now, but I was fortunate enough to live in San Diego back in the late 90s and early 2000s, and was at the Rose Bowl in the final in 99.
Oh, boy.
And also got a chance to watch a fair number of San Diego Spirit games in the first year of WUSA. And, having watched all the way through the NWSL bubble that just happened here. And by the way, the Houston Dash winning it surprised people down here as much as it did everybody else.
I don't want to say it was a fluke. They earned it, but it takes a little bit of luck to win a knockout tournament. They got a bit of luck.
Yeah, but
still, yeah.
And I think to a great extent, you can probably attribute a lot of that to them not having any U.S. national team players. It creates a dynamic in the team that was interesting. But I guess the question I wanted to ask you was, with all the progress that's been made through the years, I was a little taken aback when USL announced that they were going to now come up with a league of their own. And just an editorial comment, I don't understand why we keep doing this to ourselves as a country. But what do you make of this? I mean, clearly they had, Francisco Marcos had the foresight back in the 90s to create a women's, league within the framework of what then was, some version of USL. But what do you make of USL doing it right now? What impact do you think that's going to have on the, the overall growth of women's soccer in the country?
Well, this is a good time to plug my other book, Why the U.S. Men Will Never Win the World Cup, because that's one of the features that you've all run into this, where we keep running into each other. We aren't content. And the story I often tell is being at the organization then known as the NSCAA, their annual convention, the great thing. And I'm sorry I won't see you all in Anaheim this year because they've gone all virtual, understandably so. But I went to a presentation that was really packed with a couple of people from Germany, and one of the guys was asked, what's the biggest difference you see between German youth soccer and American youth soccer? He said, well, in American youth soccer, you have all these different organizations that are, that are claiming to do this and that. In Germany, it went like this. So yeah, I think for the USL to start its own, I don't understand the point. I don't see what they're trying to do. It's funny because the USL has always been such an odd organization, and they do so many things. It seems like they'll do something spectacularly right and then something spectacularly wrong. And it's good to give credit to Francisco Marcos, you're right, for the W League, because that sustained U.S. soccer in a lot of dark times. It preceded WUSA. I mean, it was there in the mid 90s and so forth. So it was an opportunity to play at a decent level. And there was some decent soccer played there in all those years. And when a professional league would come along, it would maybe grumble a bit, but it would accept that it's now essentially the second tier. And then when WSA went away, it bounced back up. WPSL broke away from that. I have to say that WPSL a lot looser than the W League. It's essentially, oh, you have a few $1,000s and want to pay a fee? Yeah, okay, you can play. So you'll have a pretty good team like the New England Mutiny, which is a terrific organization, going up and playing some dude who has like one good high school player who then fills out the rest of the team with whoever else he can find, and then they go lose 10-0. But that said, Jerry Zanelli, who ran WPSL, recently passed away, grand old man of the game, and stepped up to do WPSL Elite here. You kind of wonder what would 2012 have been like if there was one organization, and the Sounders who were playing the WPSL Elite alongside everybody. And I asked Charlie Namo, who was the coach of the New Jersey Wildcats back in the Kelly Smith, Marinette Pichon days, was the longtime coach and general manager. He was actually the general manager of the Los Angeles Soul in WPS, and he ran Pally Blues, the team that had Lynn Williams, and the talent that ran through Pally Blues was just amazing. And you look at that team that year. I mean, there was Engen, there was an Australian national, there was an Italian national playing in goal. Sarah Huffman, best known, perhaps unfortunately, as Abby Wambat's wife, but legitimate professional in her right. So a really good team there. And they never got the chance to play WPSL Elite. So it's kind of like what we talked about in travel soccer, where you have these teams that probably should be playing each other and aren't. So I'd be curious to know what USL's reasoning is for getting into this. And of course, the funny thing is, perhaps the most prominent USL owner these days is Steve Malik in North Carolina. And guess what? He has an NWSL team, a very, very good NWSL team that, again, has dominated. In fact, they dominated the round robin, the group stage in Utah, and then the genius of Mark Parsons to somehow get what was left of the Portland Thorns without Haran, Haran was in that game, but without Becky Sauerbrunn and a few other, and Tobin Heath and a few other players, somehow got them to beat North Carolina. So I don't know. My guess is that it won't actually happen.
Do we have any other questions around? Any last thoughts that anybody wants to present while we still have Beau here?
Thank you all for the opportunity. This was such a fun project to do. I mean, it was a good way to kind of make the best of a bad situation. I started working on it a little bit when I had my thankfully mild case of COVID. I caught it in mid-March before we understood that we were supposed to be wearing masks and so forth. So I got it out of the way, which was good. And also supposedly the risk of it gets worse when you hit 50, and I caught it a couple of weeks before I turned 50. So I had an opportunity to do something when I was confined to the basement, and I'm glad that it turned out. I'm glad that you all have taken an interest in it. So thanks so much.
Certainly, yeah. Thank you for everybody here. It was a pleasure to have you here. For everybody that's watching after the fact, be sure to check out Beau Dure's book here, 2012. And Thank you for tuning in. We'll be here with you all next month for our next First Friday session.
Cool. Looking forward to it.